So welcome to this session. Today the workshop topic is around how to innovate smart with API first design and development. And yeah, so this is me. I'm Himasha Guruge, and I'm part of the solutions architecture team at WSO2. That's my LinkedIn handle. If you want to contact me, you can use that. Okay. So before we go into further details, I just want to start off with this state of the API economy that was published last year. So excerpt from that. So this basically looked at how different organizations globally reacted to digital transformation during the time of the pandemic, right? And what they found out was that nearly about 3 in 4 of these organizations, they continued whatever the digital transformation efforts that they were trying to do despite the pandemic. And about 2/3 of these organizations, they either, continued whatever the investments that they did in terms of DT, or they kind of changed their overall strategy so that, they could build this whole digital first within their organization, right? So for any organization that's out there, the most important asset that you hold is the data and the services that you offer to your customers. So digital transformation in simplest form is an organization's ability to convert this valuable data and services into some sort of a reusable format so that they could quickly, mix and match and use those assets in different contexts and when different situations arise. So we saw this in practice during the pandemic, where almost, I think, all industries had to revolve whatever the services that they offered around a more homebound lifestyle, from shopping to their day-to-day banking services, lending, when even entertainment with streaming services, and of course with remote work coming into place, how do you communicate, the various communication methods and tools that came into place. So in this context, APIs are a really great enabler. Why? Because APIs basically provide this standard access point to whatever the data or the services that you hold, so that the creators in your organization can actually leverage and reuse those APIs to build whatever the great idea that you have and take that to market, right? So digital transformation, in my opinion, is more of a proactive thing. So you need to work on it and build that over time so that whenever a situation comes up, you are ready to, you have the necessary assets to go and kind of meet that challenge, right? Okay, so APIs are great and APIs are everywhere and everybody is trying to use APIs in their organization. But unfortunately, not all companies, or only a very few companies, find their digital transformation that they have done to be very effective, right? So regardless of people using APIs, innovation is still a struggle. And then most organizations find it hard to, meet their deadlines and go to market as soon as possible, of course. And doing a change or making a change or accommodating a change request is very hard, because it could be a simple change request, but with the way you have implemented, the way you have developed whatever that feature or product, you need to enforce that change in multiple layers, and that really takes a lot of effort and time. And there's a lot of redundant code, probably to do the same thing for some shared features or services. People use different tools and formats and create code. So there's a lot of duplicate code doing the same thing out there. And of course, in terms of APIs, most of the time, APIs are built as an afterthought of this whole development process. So it's not really, APIs are hardly built with a purpose or with their value in mind, right? Okay, so let's take a look at this with an example. So let's assume that there's a company called Binary Tech, and as part of their customer retention exercise, the sales team decide that we have a plan to kind of offer a special discount. So they're a global company. So to the top 3 customers, based on whatever the sales that was processed of a given quarter, to offer them a special discount. So this requirement comes to the team, and they are supposed to build this web application to facilitate this, where the sales team would basically provide the information like the customer ID and probably the year and the quarter that they're looking at. And then this web application is to provide information on if that relevant customer is eligible for this discount. That is, of course, to check if that customer is within the top 3 customers of that quarter. And then, of course, if the customer is eligible, to get some further information on the loyalty points and probably the sale amount and some other details that are required for the sales team to create this discount amount. So if we look at this, or try to do this in a code-first approach, what code-first approach means is that you start with the code, right? So probably the process will be that the backend team would have a bit of design on the feature, how they're going to implement. They would probably build the database schemas and the necessary services, and of course work on the logic. And then once that is done, they would probably deploy that and then create an API, which would help the front-end teams to basically use it to retrieve that relevant data from the backend. So then the front-end teams would use that API, create whatever the application, in this case a web application, using that API to get the data, and they would make or deploy their code into probably like into a QA environment. And then only the quality assurance team would get involved and try to test out that feature, maybe along with some user stories that they have. Right? So that's the typical process in a code-first approach. So there are a couple of issues in this process. The first one being disconnected developer experience, right? As you saw, it's more of a sequential process. So there is some level of dependency between the teams. So there's no parallel work that you can really do in this aspect, right? So, and troubleshooting is not something straightforward, right? For example, if when the QA teams try to test it out and they figure out there's something wrong, what they usually do is first raise a ticket with the front-end team, and then the front-end team would check whatever the logic or the application that they have built and probably figure out, this is working fine. It's just a matter of fact that we are not getting data from the backend. And maybe it could be the case where the backend team has changed the API or has done some kind of a change over there. So as you can see, it's not a straightforward process, where you can pinpoint, this is the place that we need to look at. Probably all the teams need to go through and figure out what's wrong. And accommodating change requests. So for example, let's assume that the sales team gets back and say, once we figure out the discount for eligible customers, we also need to automatically send an email to the relevant representative of that customer. So we basically, the front-end team says that they need the email address of that respective customer. So this means the backend team goes back and probably change their SQL queries to retrieve that relevant data as well, and then provide it to the front end, and front end needs to populate that information as well. So as you can see, even a small change request will actually take a lot of layers to be changed and a lot of teams to be involved, which of course will take more time. And working on new features or expansions would typically require a lot of rework or duplicate work. For example, let's assume that the marketing team comes up and says, we want this, whatever, let's say like a mobile application or web application, where we need to understand we need to build some content, use cases, and for that we need to get information of the top tier customers for a given quarter. And also, in addition to that, would require some information from the CRM, like Salesforce, on the industry, because they want to categorize that based on the industry and the products used, etc. So actually, the first bit of it is quite similar to the scenario we discussed earlier, but because it's a code-first approach, and there's no point of separation that you can, where you can share that bit of code with the other application. It means that probably the teams would have to re-implement whatever that logic and that work for that relevant application as well. So, this kind of highlights the point of when you have an API, you need to build, or you need to create an API with the intended user experience in mind, right? You need to figure out what's the value of this API and what's the value it is to the intended parties. And then from there, you need to figure out the rest of the process for that API to really provide you the advantage it's supposed to do. So the solution to this is that you start with an API first approach, where you build APIs with the intended user experience in mind. And in order to do so, you start with the APIs, you treat the APIs as first-class citizens, and the rest of the process will continue from there. Okay. So let's revisit the same scenario with an API first design and development. So what this means is, in terms of the API first design, the teams would basically start by creating the API contract. So something like a Swagger specification, where you define what you are going to expose, or what you're going to provide through this API, right? Like the different resources, what are the parameters and the payloads that's going to be involved, are there any header values that you need to work on, and also create mock responses that are to be expected when you use this API. And of course, when it comes to front-end work, having some sort of toolkits would be really useful for the front-end team, so then they can just plug and play that within whatever the framework or the language that they use to kind of invoke this API. And things like visibility control. So probably not, you have multiple teams and not all the teams would require to access this API. So then you can enforce the relevant visibility controls as well. So similarly, what happens is, so this is not like a one-time process. It's a couple of iterations where you involve all the stakeholders to get the relevant feedback, right? So in this case, which would mean like the sales team, someone from the sales team, maybe the BAs, folks representing the backend team, the front-end team, probably the testing folks, and also even the technical writers as well. So once you go through a couple of iterations, it would get to a stage where all the stakeholders kind of agree, this is what we want to do and this is what we want to represent. And then once you reach that stage, you could pre-release this API, right? Where, if you use an API management solution, you'll have a catalog where all these different parties can access that API and use it or try it out. So, for example, your front-end teams can download the toolkits relevant to the application and basically invoke that API. So once the API first design bit is completed and you have like a mock API ready for the different teams to work on, so this means now your QA team can basically refer to that Swagger specification that you have and create API test collections. Your technical writers can take a look at that and create work on the API documentation. Similarly, the backend teams would work on the backend integrations, and front-end teams can get the toolkits, the SDKs, and work on the applications that they're building. And of course, your API management team, your API designers can further improve the API that you created to make it into a managed API, like applying the necessary securities, probably the options that you discussed, and decide what kind of plans, business plans you're going to include, rate limiting options, and so forth. So let's look at this with a demonstration. So I'm going to take the same scenario, and I'm going to cover the API design aspect. And in terms of the API development part, we'll be looking at the backend integration, right? And let's assume that along with following API first approach, this relevant team, the backend team, wants to perform the integrations also in an API-led manner. So what this means is that your integration flow, working with the different services, the transformations, orchestrations that you want to do to create that overall output is done through APIs. Right? So when we talk about API-led integration, there are three main types of APIs that you can build. So this experience APIs, in this case, we'll call it the rewards API, would basically the rewards API would basically focus on the end experience, the user experience that it should provide. And then, of course, at the bottom layer, we have the system APIs. So these services are basically focused on, connecting to your core services and just, unlocking that data. Right? And then in between, you have something called process APIs. So process APIs are usually built with a specific business logic or a business use case in mind. So in this case, we'll call it the discounts API, where we need to first, go through this sales service and see who are the top, if the relevant customer is within the top 3-tier customers. And then if of course, that means the customer is eligible for a discount. And if that's the case, it would call this membership data service as well, and where it would connect to a database which has information like loyalty points, contact details, and so forth, and provide that information. So at the end of it, the discounts API needs to kind of combine the information obtained from these two services and provide a final response to the rewards API. Okay, so for the demonstration, I'll be using WSO2's integration platform, API Manager, and Micro Integrator to build the experience and the process layer. And then, of course, for the system APIs, I have used Ballerina, which is a programming language built for the web. But of course, this could mean any other technology as well. So before I go to this bit, so let's start off with the experience API. So that's the API design part. So this is the publisher component or the UI where you can create and design APIs in WSO2 API Manager. So of course, we need to start from scratch, and we are going to call this rewards API. So at this point, I don't have an endpoint because we are first designing the API contract. So I'm going to leave it blank. So this is the point where, of course, you need to figure out the resources that you're trying to expose from this. So in this case, let's just have one called get customers. And we need to pass, so basically, we have some query parameters for this resource. So the first one being the customer ID will be provided. And that is a mandatory parameter. And then probably the year, which is also required. And then probably the quarter as well. And let's say that's not mandatory. So if the query is not entered, then you get the last quarter of that year, right? So let's assume that's a requirement in this case. Okay, so you similarly you kind of decide and design the relevant resources that you're going to expose from make available through this API. So once that's done, you can take a look at the API definition that gets created. So this is going to be like the single source of truth for the various teams to refer to. And then we have the endpoint section. So at this stage, we just want to add a mock implementation to this resource that we have. So I'm just going to leave it as it is, but basically you can change and create the required mock response. Right. And then, of course, you can work on other details. But once you get to that stage where you're ready to share it with the teams and start the development phase, you can go and deploy it. So here the API manager has this concept of deploying revisions. So revision is basically the API snapshot at a given time. So we can add a description. Say customer rewards. And you can select. So if there are multiple API gateways, you could deploy to multiple API gateways as well. But at this point, we're just deploying it. Yeah. Okay. So the next step is to pre-release this API through the lifecycle management stage. So right now it's in created. So instead of publish, we are going to pre-release this. And now if we go to the developer portal, where probably the rest of the teams would come and try to work on this or access this API. So it's a pre-released API. So basically, there's a tryout section where you can try it out and see what the response is going to be. And SDK section will list down whatever the frameworks or languages that you have configured. It will create automatically these SDKs. So your front-end teams can basically download and start working on their app. And here you also have a Postman collection related to this API. So your QA team can probably work on this, and you can also download the Swagger specification, maybe for your technical writers to take a look at that and work on the documentation. So similarly, the different teams can work together in parallel, start the relevant work through this. Okay, so before we go into the integration part, I just want to show you quickly the backend services that I have. So I'm going to go through the diagrammatic view, so it's easy for you to take a look at it. So here we have a service that's listening into this port, and we have a resource called sales. So this is a sales service, and it takes in the relevant parameters, and there's some validations that we do here. But in the interest of time, I'll just leave it at here, right? So basically, this is the process. And then the second, the membership service, again, is basically where we need to connect to that database and retrieve the relevant information. So again, it's called membership service, and this is the resource that we're interested in, which has a resource called loyalty points, and it takes a customer ID and probably query the customers table where that customer ID is matching. And so the sales service, basically, I have used some hard-coded values that will be provided based on the information that this service gets for demo purposes. Okay, so now let's go back. So now we have done the API design. Now it's time to do the backend implementation. So this is the Integration Studio, the tooling component for the micro integrator, the integration profile that we have. So let's say that we start off with discounts. integration service. Let's create a project first. And yeah, so before I go ahead with the rest, I'll just define the two backend service endpoints. So then it's easy for me to work on the rest. So first one is we need to query the sales endpoint. Right? And as we saw, it's an HTTP endpoint. And the URI template is this, the sales resource, and we need to pass this information like the customer ID, the year, and the quarter. So I'll show you how we can directly access these query parameters in a bit, but just take a look at the URI template here. And then we need another backend service. We have another backend service, so let's add that endpoint as well. And call it query membership endpoint, which is again an HTTP endpoint. And this is the URI template for it. Membership service, loyalty points, resource, and we're passing the customer ID. Okay, so now we have the two backend endpoints defined. So the next step is I'm going to start working on my discounts service or discounts API. So a typical integration, the backend engineer or an integration developer can, what they can do at this point is create a REST API, and there are multiple options on how you can create a REST API. So right now I'm going to say import the API from API Manager. So how this works is you can, there's a specific role for users to be associated so they can list APIs from the API Manager. So I have this role allocated to me, so I can probably go and list the APIs. So it will basically list all the APIs that are available in API Manager, which right now is the rewards API. So I'm going to import that API. And what this will do is basically import the Swagger specification into this project. And it will also create this template model where you can go ahead and create your overall integration flow utilizing that service. Right. So if you check the resources section, it will have the relevant Swagger specification of the rewards API that we created through the API Manager. Right, resources metadata. Here you can see the Swim Swagger specification, and this is the integration flow that we are going to develop. Right, so let's take a look at the properties. So we want to call this the discounts API, and be like this. And then if you check the resource, yeah, so this is the resource that we defined, get customers. And then now we can build rest of the flow. So first going to delete the template models. Right. Okay. So first of all, I need to kind of store the incoming customer ID value into this message context. So these are different mediators that you can use to build the message flow on what you need to do to the incoming message and the different transformations that you need to do. So this property mediator basically allows you to kind of store values so that you can use that property at a later time and get that value through that property. So this customer ID is something I'm going to need later on. So I'm going to create that. And because this is coming as a query parameter, I can get it through the URL, right? And set that into this new property. Okay. So then the next step is, of course, to call the sales endpoint that we have. So since I defined it before, it's available under the defined endpoints. So I can use the query sales endpoint and invoke it. So now the next step is basically if the customer, if there's no matching record for that given customer ID, then we need to create this format one payload where we provide the customer ID and say that the eligibility is false. Right. So to figure that out, let's assume that this backend service will just send me like an empty array. This is the format of the sample payload. So let's say that in the case that there's no matching customer, we need to figure out the payload that we need to provide. So I'm going to use something called a switch mediator. So the source is going to be, it's a JSON response that I'm getting from the backend service. So I'm going to say JSON evaluate. This is the format that I'm getting, and it's an array, but in this case, we are just getting one single item. So I can just say customer ID. Yeah, so we have a design and a source view in this. So you can easily go to the source view and also do the changes. So similarly, I can set first case is where, you know, if you're not getting a response, if it's an empty response, and then the default flow should be in this tag, right? So let's go back to the design view, and yeah, so let's first work on this. So we need to create a payload in the format that we just had a look at. So you go to the payload. There's something called the payload factory mediator where you can kind of create a payload that you want. So we need to send a JSON response. So I'm going to say JSON, and this is the format that we are interested in. So the customer ID should be, the value should be dynamically passed. So I'm going to use the previous property that we created, which is in the message context. So I can say context and refer to that property name so that the dynamic value will be passed. And of course, this is a static value. Right. So once that is defined, I just need to respond back to the customer. But before that, I'm going to add two properties so that I format, because it's a JSON response that I want to send. So let me quickly add the message type. And so here we are expecting application JSON. And we also need to set the content type as a header value. So can select that. Okay. Content type. Let me go back to the source. Yes, I think I made a mistake there. Yeah, message type, and yeah, should work. Yeah, I just copy through this. Okay, so now we have set the relevant properties and we can directly respond back to the client, right? If this is a flow. Then if it's a successful response, then again, I need some information because I need the sale amount of that relevant customer ID. So I'm going to save that, which is of type okay, so the sale amount that we defined, the value that's going to come in is double. So I'm going to use that, and I'm going to call it the sale amount. And again, we can define it through an expression because it's coming from the JSON payload. You can say JSON evaluate. And says amount. So then we need to call the second endpoint, second backend service that we have. So which is the query membership, which will basically talk to the database and get the values. So once you have that, so if we check the format of the second one, so we have the customer ID, we have the sale amount. The points and email comes from this service. So let me store those values as well. So let's say contact email. And we can just say JSON evaluate. I think it says contact. And then we'll need another property to store the points, which is an integer. So let's call it points. And we can get the value like this. Okay, so now we have all the information that we need. We just need to create the relevant payload. So we're going to use the payload factory again. Again, we need a JSON response. And this is going to be the format for that flow. So here we have a set of dynamic values starting from the customer ID. So let's get that. So actually the customer ID, you can directly get it from the URL itself because it's a query parameter value, but I'm just going to stick to this. And then the second one is static value. So the second dynamic value is points. So let's create that. From the points property, where we stored the value. And next one is the sale amount. And the final one is the email, which we stored in a property called contact email. So now we have passed all the values. Right. All the dynamic values are set. And similar to the previous flow, we need to send the relevant, the header values and respond. So to save time, I'm just quickly going to copy this bit. And so now we are done with the overall service. So you can see the entire flow through the design view as well. So once that is done, how we kind of connect whatever we created with the API design that we did is through this metadata for the discount service. So here you can define the key for this service. Let's call it discounts API. Right. Save time, let me just choose the same thing. So this is some metadata related to the process API that we created. And let's call it ability for discount. And then this, of course, you can set through dynamic values, but the demo, I'm just going to directly set this, find it as discounts, right? So you can complete this metadata for this discount API that we created, this one. And once that is done, now you can deploy it to the micro integrator profile. Right? So within the tooling itself, there is this embedded runtime, which I'm going to use. So I'm going to deploy this one. Yeah, just need this. So now ideally, in the console, you can see the micro integrator starting up and basically deploying the service that we just created. Okay, so here we can see that deployed API is available. So now what, as an integration developer, I have done and probably, deployed the code to the relevant environment. So now if we go back to our API manager, and if you go to endpoints, here you have an option called service endpoint. So you can basically select the various services or APIs that you have deployed to your micro integrator runtime. So here we just, this is the key that we use, discounts API, and you can see the URL as well and save it. Right, so that's the new endpoint for this. And then we need to deploy this, deploy it as a new revision. So I'm going to say production AP for rewards API. I can select deploy. So now I can see the deployed revision is the second revision, and we have the mock API. If needed, you can easily revert back to the relevant revision as well. So now before actually, if you can check it here, it's the API is still in the pre-release stage. So what in reality, what you can do is you can have some test gateways and first deploy that new revision with the new endpoint into that specific gateway, and then you can, from the publisher portal itself, you can try it out and basically test the process. So this, so based on the data that I have, yeah, so this customer is not eligible, and pick one where we have some data, and that customer is eligible, and we get the relevant information. So you get the test the flow, and then finally, once everything is completed, you can move the API into the published state, and yeah, so it's ready for your consumers to actually go ahead and consume it. Right. So moving back, I think we are quite up with the time. So just want to highlight, how you can kind of go ahead and innovate and reuse these artifacts. The same marketing use case that we discussed through the promotions API, how you can reuse the sales service in that process as well. So overall, this helps you to kind of build that intended experience, because there's a clear abstraction layer where, if there's a change request, you can really focus and on that relevant specific service or an API, rather than having to do the relevant changes at each and every stage, right? For example, if you want to change the database at a later time, what happens is you can just focus on that membership data API that we created, rather than having to go through, having to change at all levels. And then it helps you to go through rapid innovation, because to support new channels, you can have this automatically downloadable SDKs. And then, of course, you can reuse assets for various future extensions as well. Yes, so I think that's all I had. I don't think we have time to take any questions, because I'm kind of over time with my the session time that was allocated. But please reach out if you want to discuss anything, or if there's any questions that you would like to get clarified. So thank you very much for joining this session. Yeah, thanks.